Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Plummer. I'm a managing director of TEFAF New York, the new art fair that opens tomorrow at the Park Avenue Armory. We're delighted that all of you are here to join us for this keynote speech by Luke Syson to kick off this TEFAF week of events. It has been quite an adventure bringing TEFAF Maastricht to New York. I personally started down this road it was in July of 2015 with my business partner, Jeff Rabin. We went into discussions with TEFAF then because we had always thought New York being a cultural capital, one of the cultural capitals of the world, with great institutions like the Met and the Frick and the Morgan and others, deserved to have an art fair of that caliber and that standing, particularly in what we refer to as the historical arts. And so we entered into negotiations, discussions with TEFAF to Maastricht to bring them to New York. And as of February 3rd, we made it official. And in, I don't know how many months it's been, but in a few short months, we have now brought the fair to New York. And at the core principle of bringing the TEFAF Maastricht to New York was to bring a new burst of energy into the field of collecting of art prior to the 20th century. I think it's been much talked about in the press and much talked about in the collecting circles that there has been perhaps an excessive, not to put a value judgment on it, but an emphasis in certain areas on the 20th century to the detriment of other areas of art. And we saw this at TEFAF as a chance to re-energize the collecting field in these areas in New York. And I think if you all get yourselves over to the Armory in the next few days, you'll see an animal of entirely different order than has been there before. But central to all of this is not just an art fair selling art, but is educating new collectors in these fields of art. And so a part and parcel of that was putting together a cultural program that discusses issues surrounding that and brings in new and younger audiences. And when we were setting out to create this cultural program, the name that kept coming up to the surface that represented this enthusiasm and passion and new way of thinking about the historical arts was Luke Syson. So very early on, I was introduced to Luke, and I saw his TED Talk, and I was blown away by it. And if any of you have not seen it yet, I really strongly suggest that you see it. It's available on YouTube. And I loved his enthusiasm, his passion, and his way of looking at the historical arts in a new and interesting way. So he graciously agreed to be our keynote speaker because we think that this idea of re-energizing collecting in this area is central to this week of TEFAF, not just the collecting in the fair itself, but the cultural programming. So I'm delighted to introduce Luke, and here he is, the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor chairman of the European and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thank you.
Behind you.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is actually a very historic evening. TEFAF coming to New York is a very big deal indeed, I think, for this whole field. So I'm afraid I'm going to begin as if I've won some sort of award. You have to decide for yourselves what kind of award that might have been. I can tell you it's not for dance. I wanted to do that in order to thank what is really a wonderful team of curators in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met. What I'm going to talk about this evening is very, very much a joint effort. This is our endeavor, not just mine. And so to make that clear, I want to list the 9 curators with whom I'm privileged to work. Eleanor Alcorn, Denise Allen, Peter Bell, Emerson Boyer, Lizzie Cleland, Daniela Kisluk-Grossheider, Wolfram Körper, Jeff Munger, and Melinda Watt. Not only have they contributed to the acquisition of every single object that you'll see tonight, but these are people whose research I'm using shamelessly in the lecture I'm about to present. You'll also see on several of the slides the names of members of our support group, the ESDA Visiting Committee and others who have been absolutely instrumental in making sure that some of the objects that you're seeing have arrived on these shores and are now exhibited at the Met. So I'd like to thank them as well. Okay, so earlier this year, we bought this piece, a régulateur, a piece which stands, in a sense, for a very traditional kind of collecting at the Met, playing to strength. French 18th century furniture is one of the glories of the Metropolitan Museum. But in some ways, too, it is about as unfashionable an object as you can possibly hope to imagine. A clock, apart from anything else, is incredibly boring because you have to wind it up and know how to do it. And I think part of the problem, too, is that we've presented these pieces sometimes in a less than fascinating way. So this would be an approximately traditional mode of presenting this piece, which I think one would begin to describe in, as I say, this traditional way as important. Important because it typifies Rococo workmanship, and we didn't until this point have a major piece of Rococo horology. That Balthazar Liotard is one of the greatest cabinet makers of his day, and that the Swiss-born Ferdinand Berthoud was a great pioneer of clockmaking. This is one of his first equation clock, which was presented at the French Academy des Sciences in April 1752. Berthoud was allowed into the French Guild despite being born outside France, thanks to the support of Louis XV. So far, so good, but maybe not so gripping if you're not already a convert to this material. No one outside a very limited circle have ever heard of Berthoud or Liotard, and if presented in this way to a potential buyer or actually a visitor to the museum, this isn't going to be the way in which somebody is going to be grabbed. I should say, by the way, that this is a piece that we bought at Maastricht, and that's an important fact too. Part of the problem, I think, is that that despite these extraordinary details and the glory of the gilt bronze workmanship, a piece like this is associated with interiors like this one, somewhat over lavish, heavy, full of furniture, and this was just a mere 50 years ago, and yet it feels as if it belongs to a completely different age. This was the person who lived in that house from which this library came, Judge Erwin Untermeyer, an amazing figure in the history of the Met, whose contribution to the collections, particularly of British decorative arts, was absolutely extraordinary. I have a feeling he was slightly scary, but not perhaps as scary as these people with whom he has slight family resemblance, it has to be said. So I think the Adams family have come to typify a certain kind of interior, and I think the contents of those interiors have taken on something of the character of these figures here. This, in case you're wondering, is a still from the Day of the Dead. So that's one problem. The idea of these objects as essentially no longer alive, that they belong to a previous generation, they're too familiar in some ways and unfamiliar in others, because the history of these periods is less well known. And I think, too, that the part of the problem is that there's a lack of ability to differentiate between an extraordinary piece of 18th century workmanship and something like this. I looked up kitsch clock on Google, and this is what I found. I think I've done pretty well, I have to say. Anyway, so I think if you think about the combination of kitsch and Gothic, you arrive at something akin to Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which I admit will have its market, but not perhaps a very energetic part of the market for collectors. So a set of essentially negative associations, too old, too dead, too kitsch. that we have to get past. And when I say we, I mean all of us, because I think what we've learned as a group in ESDA is to start re-evaluating a whole range of works of art that we might not ourselves even have collected at the Met a few years back. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Now, obviously, there are ways in which we need to think about presenting these works anew, and some of those are physical. So here is Berthou's Régulateur, as it was displayed at the Met in our, I have to say, I think, very elegant show, The Luxury of Time. This perhaps looks fairly traditional, although clean and sharp. This is how the piece looked, surrounded by other great long-glazed clocks, including the Röntgen piece that we bought also last year. It was a great year for the clock. But this was where we pushed the boat out a little. Michael Langley, our very own Met designer, was the person who came up with this, thinking, I think, a little bit about a kind of retail language which has not traditionally belonged to the fine and decorative arts. As you can see, a mass of perspex and a framing of these objects very much as if they were almost pictures in their own right. These, therefore, provide an extraordinary contrast with these great 18th century clocks. I think, again, provide clues to people, potentially, as to how they can be seen not so much as a product of a particular historic moment, although, of course, that's important, but as something which has a timeless quality. I'm showing you this, I'm sorry, absolutely horrible picture taken with my phone this morning. It's absolutely topical, though, even more than the presidential debate, because it shows the exhibition that's just opened at the Met today, called Italian Maiolica, Painted Pottery for Shelf and Table, a celebration of our Italian ceramics, coinciding with the publication of Tim Wilson's Highlights volume. And as you can see, once again, we're showing this, even, I hope from this horrible picture, we're showing this material in a modern, clean way, so that the amazing group of pharmacy vessels here, you can imagine in almost any interior. This might not be an object to persuade you that we're moving out of the world of kitsch, but it is. Part of the issues here, I think, are not so much to do with presentation in a physical way, but actually presentation in an intellectual way. And I want to use this object to show you what I mean. When the dealer showed me photographs of this in New York, the piece was then in London, I thought to myself, must be completely mad. I am the curator of the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition. I am not going to buy a little marble Maltese terrier for the Met. And that is an example of of the kind of prejudice that I'm talking about. I then went to see some very, very serious objects with this particular dealer, Venetian glass, ivories, when we could still buy them, and so on, and then passed this piece, and it caught my eye. It caught my eye for a range of reasons, but primarily because of its quality. I think, though, that it was probably the most controversial piece that I've so far bought with colleagues for the Met. The funding was a little hard to find, although, as you can see perhaps from the slogan at the bottom, Barbara Walters did in the end pay for it in honor of Cha-Cha, her own dog. And so that adds another layer of meaning to this object in a delightful way, I think. But one of the trustees, when they saw both the object and the acquisition line, said I'd brought the Met to a new low. So anyway, I want to defend myself a little as a result and talk to you about why in the end I changed my mind and why I believe this to be an important case study of the kind of thing I'm talking about. So, in this case, I think a comparison with contemporary art, which I think some people have tried in museums before. Let's make this contemporary by pretending it's something that it's not, essentially, because it looks a bit like it, has been profoundly unhelpful. Jeff Koons celebrates kitsch, essentially, and seeing this terrier through his eyes doesn't help at all. Seeing it through the eyes of Stubbs, however, brings the piece into a different category. So I should give the dog that I'm afraid we've all learnt to call Cha-Cha in honor of Barbara's dog, but which is better known as the shock dog, to use the term that its sculptor used. Anne Seymour Damer. Anne Seymour Damer was, as you can tell from her name, a woman, and she was also Britain's first female sculptor of any repute. She actually took the trouble to take herself off to Rome to be trained as a carver, and this is a really remarkable thing to do. And so already we have an extra layer of meaning to this work. She's dignified this little dog in almost exactly the same way that Stubbs has dignified Whistlejacket, this great horse. He's animate, he's grand, he's proud, he's life-size. He's signed in Greek with her name, and so there's no question that this was intended deeply seriously. This is not a work of art which was meant to be necessarily cozy in any way. It's a work of art which was celebrating this particular kind of dog anatomically and as a companion to man. Two possibilities for the owner of the dog. We know that Mrs. Damer sent a marble dog to Queen Charlotte. You can see her there, looking a little like a sheep and holding a dog that looks a little like a sheep, and maybe that's our Cha-Cha. Sitting next to her with a different kind of dog, I don't know what kind of dog that is. Despite walking across Central Park every morning, I'm still not very good at the identification, is Horace Walpole, Mrs. Damer's cousin, of course the great owner of Strawberry Hill, and perhaps a little Queenie in his own right. He called his cousin the female Bernini. Bernini had carved portraits of dogs, and he introduced Mrs. Damer into a particular circle. Here she is in a statue by her master in Rome, whose name's just gone out of my head, Giuseppe Ceracchi. This is a piece at the British Museum. And standing next to her is a woman who was probably one of her lovers. This is Elizabeth Farren, an actress who made it off the stage and became later Countess of Derby. So now already we're seeing a layered quality to the story that sits behind the sculpture of the Maltese Terrier. When I add that Mrs. Damer wished to be buried with her sculptor's tools and the bones of her favorite dog, then you can see how these two things weld together. This is a woman who has taken a subject that expresses her own femininity, the whole idea of the lapdog, and is doing it in a tough, extraordinary way by carving it out of marble. We're looking at, in other words, a kind of clash of ideas that's contained within this single object that makes it much more resonant than you would necessarily expect at first sight. That's the kind of thinking, a larger thinking about works of art that I think is helpful, a larger kind of meta-narrative rather than simply saying, rather than giving you the chapter and verse. Let me give you another example. Until quite recently, the market for Spanish polychrome sculpture was minimal. Thanks to an extraordinary exhibition at the National Gallery in London, which came to the National Gallery here in Washington, called The Sacred Made Real, people suddenly became aware of coloured sculpture as an extraordinary category in its own right. At the same time, the dealers, Colin Cortez, started showing sculpture very much in the way that Xavier Bray, the curator of the show, had shown the pieces at the National Gallery. In other words, there was a direct relationship between how the museum behaved and then what happened subsequently in the market. The Met had not bought a piece since the 1960s in this category, and we chose at that point to make it more of a priority. And these were the pieces with which we started. Now, once again, this is a category of work that actually still needed justifying two quite surprising numbers, not this time of our trustees, but of our peers at the Met. They were too inclined to see these pieces through the eyes of this Madonna. She seems to have just stepped off a moving van, I'm not quite sure why, and but the kind of tacky plaster saint that are all too familiar from churches. And once again, the contemporary commentary on this kind of piece is actually sort of actively, in a sense, unhelpful. It accentuates the tackiness while bringing the object into a different zone. Same is true, I think, for the horrors of war, the somewhat glib works of art that the Chapman brothers produce. I want to show you simply, in this case, some extraordinary details of this work. The incredible balance, in a sense, between naturalism and abstraction, between the human and the divine that you see in this work. So starting with the Christ, I mean, just look at those hands and the way that they're bound by the rope. It's the pathos and suffering of this figure is, to me, absolutely extraordinary. Here is his back, the rope going around the hair of his neck, nestling in his hair. And there are the streaks of blood, which show his suffering during the flagellation, and the bruising. It's a very moving piece. It's a piece that I think communicates and explains, of course, the Madonna's own reaction. These tears that come down from her cheek, from her glass eyes with real eyelashes. The kind of thing, again, that for many people put this sort of object beyond the pale, the kind of object that is too far away from the white beauty of the sculpture, of the marble sculpture of Michelangelo, for example. But again, the tenderness and precision of the gestures, her hand to her breast, her other one extended, are absolutely extraordinary. And here again are details of her face, of displaying her grief, which I think are as poignant as anything you could hope to see. This is a mother truly grieving for her son. At the same time, the draperies are marvelously grand. Her gesture is rhetorical. This is a performing piece in a way. And so what we're looking at again is a whole set of ideas about what sculpture can do, how it can move beyond the category art and move into our lives and affect our emotions in a very, very direct way. That's, again, an example of what I call a meta-narrative, a way of getting people to look which doesn't depend on knowing every detail of Pedro de Mena's career. We don't need to know who his master is. We don't need to know where this even came from, because this piece is communicating in that direct way. Another piece of Spanish sculpture, this time even more newly acquired, and by another female sculptor. I think it's important, as much as possible, to show that women made a substantial contribution to the visual arts when they did. We obviously buy pieces of the quality that merit that assessment. This is by Luisa Roldan, the daughter of Pedro Roldan, a Sevillian sculptor, and was made after she moved to the court of Madrid as an ornament of the court and the sculptor to the king. This was a piece that was made, in fact, when a new king came to the throne, and she wanted to demonstrate her own extraordinary abilities. The piece, again, is a balancing act of a very different kind now between the mundane and the theatrical, between the heightened emotions of some of the participants and the more almost lackadaisical approach of others. And again, let me show you what I mean. Here are details of the figures, and you have to imagine it's about that wide and about that tall. So we're looking at something with extraordinary intense detail this time. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, their faces, again, scrunched up with pain and agony as they tend to the body of Christ. It has all the drama of a Soldani Benzi bronze, but at the same time, as you can see here, but at the same time it has something of the quotidian quality of the Neapolitan creche. This is the one that the Chicago the Art Institute bought, in my view, extremely sensibly recently, where, as well as the Holy Family, we have the shepherds playing musical instruments and the whole of ordinary life going on around the Holy Family. Here, then, are two figures, almost like the gravedigger in Hamlet, as standing as making commentary on this figure, on the scene of the entombment. There's no biblical reason for their presence. They're standing there simply holding up the lid of the tomb, gazing down on the events that they're seeing, somewhat quizzically, brows knitted, but not with the agony of grief that you see from the other protagonists. These are two men who are there to do their job, and their job is eventually to put the lid of the tomb over the figure of Christ, over the body of Christ. But La Roldana has made something extraordinary of that tomb lid. First of all, she shows you very carefully how little effort a professional builder, if you like, or mason or gravedigger or whatever needs to hold up an enormous slab of stone. And the slab of stone, in a sense, becomes a protagonist in its own right, a piece of abstracted, oppressive ingredient in this work. And it was Tom Hill, actually, who pointed out that it has something of the same quality as a great slab by Richard Serra, or as Emerson Boyer, my colleague, pointed out, these kind of blocks by Donald Judd. I think here, at least, the kind of analysis of the parts of the sculpture by reference to contemporary art are not unhelpful. So we need to think judiciously about how we use these parallels. It's hard to judge completely, but I think this might be the favorite object that we've bought since I got to the Met 5 years ago. I absolutely love this piece. I think it's one of the most ambitious pieces of silver I've ever seen. I'm going to show you quite a lot of details of it, but I think, again, we have a lovely parallel here, which is actually a useful one. This is Damien Hirst's Cupid's Lie. It shows a little dead skeletal Cupid. So that whole idea of, and cast as you see in gold. So there's a brilliant thing going on here about preciousness, about the fleeting nature of love. I'm afraid we've all discovered that at one time or another, and the infancy of amour as well. It's a very telling piece. And you'll see that it's very much in the same spirit as the work here. So what I'm talking about now is that capacity to place an object, not just at the moment that it was made, but within a whole visual tradition, almost an emotional tradition. So anyway, to analyze the object in more detail. Here is the handle and the spout of a silver ewer. This gilding is probably more recent, made in the second quarter of the 16th century in Portugal. Portuguese silver is very rare, and this is an extraordinary survival. I mean, it seems to have escaped the melting pot at some point. The handle, as you can see, in a wonderfully imaginative way, evokes the white elephant that King Manuel I of Portugal had given to Pope Leo X at his coronation. It was an Indian elephant. It came to Rome in 1514 with the Portuguese ambassador Tristão da Cunha, and became the Pope's favorite animal, kept in the Belvedere. Poor Hanno died a couple of years later from complications for treatment for constipation with a gold-enriched laxative. Must have been a really dreadful moment in the history of the Vatican. But anyway, but the memory of this elephant obviously went on feeding the imagination of the goldsmiths in Portugal. You can see, too, that the whole piece is covered in little monsters, in skulls, in screaming heads, and so on and so forth. Here, for example, is a bird-headed figure crawling along the neck of the ewer, which is incredibly reminiscent, I think you'll all agree, of Hieronymus Bosch's paintings, which were in great vogue in the Iberian Peninsula at that moment. The whole piece, in essence, is a vanitas. This is a highly precious object made probably for the Portuguese royal family, but containing all the messages of its own destruction, all the messages about its own uselessness in an unworldly life. Here is a classic vanitas painting in which all the themes are transferred to this great ewer. There are, as you can see, are the pattern of skulls, the jester figures at the bottom in a laughing commentary, and above all, this spout, this lion-headed woman with wings, with her mouth open in a rictus grin, as if she's about to pounce. Took us, Wolfram Körper and myself, a little time to work out who she was, but this is, I think, who she is. She's the Greek Sphinx that was encountered by Oedipus on the road between Thebes and Delphi. You'll probably all remember this story. Oedipus had to answer the Sphinx's riddle correctly in order to pass. If he failed to do so, he would die, and so would all of the besieged Thebans. The riddle was, what walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night? Oedipus answered, as you'll all know, man, as an infant, he crawls on all 4s. As an adult, he walks on 2 legs. And in old age, he uses a walking stick. And I think that this is, again, a message about the passing of time, about the journey from youth to old age. This is an extraordinary thing for a ewer to contain. This is not about simply giving pleasure. It is not simply about showing off riches. It is about producing something that is in its way as riddling as the Sphinx herself. I always imagined, I have to say, that if wine was poured from the ewer, it wouldn't be white, it would have to be red. And I also thought that if it was going to be served at anybody's dinner party, it would have to be the Duchess of Malfi. This was a production I saw when I was about 16. I still remember Helen Mirren had this rope put round her neck, and the executioners just span round and round and round as she was executed at the end. Anyway, when I saw this ewer, I remembered this production. And I think that it's not far-fetched to talk about those two things together, because in a sense the ewer is full of the same kind of imagery that Jacobean drama of this kind contains. It's the same messages of great power, of great wealth, and what happens to people who enjoy that. 2 more objects that I think were set out to disturb, and which I love. Unlike the ewer, which was also a Maastricht purchase, these were bought from a private collector in London. And again, I think, are the kinds of objects that are probably destroyed by associations with pieces like this. Again, I'm afraid I shamelessly Googled kitsch porcelain vase, and this is what I came up with. If there are any admirers of this vase, I do apologize, but only a little. In this case, I think that associations with contemporary art do help a little. The commentary that Jessica Harrison makes on historic forms, and in particular, Grayson Perry, an artist who hasn't yet found a voice, I think, in this country, who uses ceramics to treat deeply serious subjects, as you can see by the title of this work here. So I think these vases have similarly strange and marvelous content, and in fact, in some ways, even more depth than Grayson Perry's work. Around the top, as you see, are two grisaille scenes, and they both show storms. This one at land, and look, by the way, just look at the quality of this painting. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to think of somebody being able to actually achieve that. Look then at the second storm, A Storm at Sea. Now, many of you be aware of the classic pairings of paintings from Poussin to Vernet of a calm and a storm, but two storms together, one at land and one at sea, the uncontrollable forces of nature let loose, is very unusual indeed. So, this was a piece that was made by Dylan Gerhardt in Paris in the 1790s. Their workshop, which they amazingly kept going during the course of the Revolution, was immediately opposite the prison where Marie Antoinette was incarcerated. So one of the things that they must have seen as they went thinking about their porcelain for the day was the head of the Princesse de Lamballe being paraded around the outside of their workshop. And I think that kind of turmoil, that sort of social turmoil, has fed into the work itself. She looks surprisingly cheery there. In contrast to the disorder of the storms is the incredible order, and again, just look at the quality, of this yellow ground grotesque work. Here what we have, I think, is a message about human ingenuity, the human ability to organize information, organize images, to create patterns. And what this Neo-Renaissance patterning is doing is looking back ultimately at the Loggia by Raphael, or in a sense fitting into the tradition that you see here in the Neo-Renaissance designs of Owen Jones. So what we have altogether, I think, are two pieces which are very deliberately setting up a contrast between, as I say, the ungovernable forces of nature and the way in which we as humans can impose order on the world around us. A message in a way that had an extraordinary resonance at the height of the French Revolution, and gets us very far away indeed from the ideas of simply determining the date and etc. of this work. We're now, I hope, talking about an unintimidating narrative, which is historically resonant, but which has a larger application even today. I wish I could linger over some of the next pieces. I can't because there isn't time this evening. But I do want to just enjoy them for a minute or two. These are also pieces that we were able to acquire at Maastricht. And again, I have to say this piece tested me quite considerably as we looked at it. It's made out of ibex horn and with gilt copper mounts. It was made for the Prince Bishops of Salzburg, and it really is a Rococo object of a kind that tests taste today. I think, though, that there is room at the moment, and especially at the moment, for thinking precisely about how to go over the top, how to really just go for it, how to just enjoy yourself when you're looking at a work of art, and when you're making a work of art and with the things that you're surrounding yourselves by. This, in a sense, is a theme that I feel very strongly about. We're at a point in our lives now when, in designing, say, iPhones, they're no longer expressive of the function of the piece. So why can't we decorate them? Why can't we ornament them? Why do we have to stick with sleek lines when we could maybe have iPhones that look like this? Similarly, another work that Lizzie Cleland championed within the department, which again tested the taste of colleagues. Because in contrast to the deeply serious, demanding vases and ewers that I've just shown you, this is a piece that simply sets out to entertain and has seemingly a tremendous sense of humor. Another Maastricht purchase, we bought it a few years ago, and it was a great moment. It shows the story of Don Quixote. But have you ever seen storytelling quite like this? It's a really remarkably inventive way of setting about treating the grotesque and making it into the story of Don Quixote, as you see, tilting at windmills. There they are, and with Sancho Panza behind him. Even the idea of incorporating a work of that kind, a story of this kind in this formula is remarkable. What becomes even more remarkable historically is that we were able to establish it was commissioned by Catherine of Braganza, the English queen, from a Soho manufactory, and sent to Portugal, perhaps a little to laugh at their Spanish neighbors. This is my favorite detail. This is, as you see, Sancho Panza yelling with his fantastic moustaches, surrounded by all these plants. There's Don Quixote, not the brightest bulb you've ever seen. And behind him is this fantastic detail of the mule eye just peeking through that little pair of feathers. These are our most recent acquisition, and these are the kinds of things that are generally now described as being opulent. That's a key word. It's almost as important, so opulent is almost used as regularly as important, and I think with as equally little meaning, quite frankly. This was a pair of candelabra that decorated the dining room of the Duke of Richmond at Goodwood House, and it exemplifies, again, in traditional museum terms, Regency taste. I just want to indulge you with some really great details of this work. Chunky, bold, brave bronze gilt in this way to show off British power at a particular moment, just following the Battle of the Nile, showing how Britain could compete with Napoleon in terms of this taste for Egyptian material, and back to sphinxes. There's a whole language here which could be analysed, which would remove this piece from its historical context simply by looking at it as a piece of design, as extraordinary casting, and an incredible, as you see, imagination. That must be one of the most endearing feat that any candelabrum was ever given. So I'm going to finish now by returning to the clock, to think a little bit more about how we can talk about this work, how we could present it in a different way. As you've heard, it was a pioneering piece of scientific design. It's very, very hard to tell that from the extremely frivolous case that this deeply serious experiment has been given. So already we have yet again a contrast, a lovely balancing act, if you like, between technology and joie de vivre. And still both of them are the product of human ingenuity. And I think that's where this wedding is most beautifully expressed. This absolutely marvelous bronzes, and as well as the lovely, whoops, I'm so sorry, the lovely wooden inlay that you can see here. But, and to make it fashionable again, well, it's an effort, but I think it's a question of how, as I say, we talk about it. Not as a primary specimen of 1750s Rococo, but as a work in which these tensions exist, which send off messages about how people want to control time, enjoy, and at the same time express themselves artistically, that there's a kind of regulating quality and a liberation that's happening in the same object at the same time. I think it's very important that we develop a new language as we talk about these works, a language which refers to some degree to the world of contemporary art, a language which also takes into better account the work that academics are doing in the universities, but perhaps translating their language into something a little bit more accessible. I'd love to banish the word important. If I receive one more dealer's blurb saying this important piece without explaining why, I'll scrumple it up and throw it at the, no, perhaps I won't. But anyway, there's something along those lines. What we need to be doing here is thinking about how we tell stories that link the past with the present. The contemporary need not be about making, but about the nature of the narrative we tell. Now, I believe that zombies are dead people who've been brought back to life, maybe not in the way that we would most want to encounter. What we need to do, I think, with these objects is bring them back to life in a different way. We need to do that by telling the stories that resonate. Thank you very much. I did say I would answer any questions if people have any, and that does, yeah, oh, there we go. That's a very good question. I think, so just for those who didn't hear it, how might one take what I've been talking about in the context of a lecture with time to make the case that I've been making and incorporate it in as a method within a museum presentation? Is that more or less what you're... Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things that we might talk about here. A couple of projects we've done and one that we're working on actively at the moment. When I first got to the department, my colleague Eleanor Alcorn said in a rather dreamy way, as we started talking about our temporary exhibition gallery as a bit more of a laboratory, she said, "Oh, I've always wanted to do a show called Plain or Fancy." And so we did. And we put a question mark at the end of that so that it was actually asking a question rather than simply instructing people with a set of historical information. What we were asking people to do was to question their own taste, think about their experience of viewing, and understand that as, to some degree, historically determined, that their tastes were not innate, but that had been formed in a range of ways. And we showed an enormous number of objects, from the very plain Christopher Dresser letter or toast rack to the most extravagant gold anchor Chelsea vases. And we were very, very struck by the results. What we discovered was that people were perfectly happy to have conversations, and that our job at that point was to equip them to do so. So, for example, we labeled some of the objects twice. We labeled them, analyzing them once as plain and once as fancy, and to talk about what that, you know, how there wasn't a single answer, and how they might resonate in different contexts and different ways. We asked people to think about what the associations were of excessive ornament, and even the fact that I used the word excessive is a bit of a giveaway, as opposed to the kind of clean, plain lines of modernism. And we put up big banners which looked at these two words, plain or fancy, and put up synonyms that were deliberately provocative. They moved from, well, under fancy, we started, I think, with flamboyant and went down to vulgar. With plain, we went from austere to dull. And this allowed people, I think, to enter into the kinds of conversation that I've been outlining now, that these were pieces, yes, which had specific historical context, which gave rise to them, but which still have an effect on us now within the kind of taste parameters that we've set ourselves. So that's one thing. The other, I think, is exemplified by a project that I'm proud that we've just begun, which is the complete refurbishment of our British galleries of decorative arts and sculpture. There we're working with the design firm Roman & Williams, who many of you may know, since I expect you all hang out there all the time, as the architects of the Boom Boom Room at the top of the Standard Hotel. Rowman and Williams are very talented storytellers, and in their visual design, and we have been working with them extremely collaboratively. So again, what we're doing is evoking, in the best Met tradition, the kind of spaces in which objects were seen originally, but with a modern twist. And in particular, we're coming up with combinations of objects which will be deliberately provocative. We're showing, and maybe this isn't as radical as it should be, but it is very unmet at the very least. We're showing Staffordshire pottery, for example, with high-level porcelain. We're thinking about how much things cost in the 18th century, and in fact, Lizzie Cleven will be curating a small exhibition about that subject as well next year. So just again, planting a question as to how to approach these objects. So the mantra for the British Galleries is creativity in an entrepreneurial society. What kind of enterprise gave rise to what kinds of creativity? And I think by asking a question in that way, then Chelsea porcelain ceases to be about moving from raised anchor to red anchor to gold anchor, and it becomes something about the commercial know-how of a silversmith who set out to meet different price points in a society which wasn't dominated by a single court. So those are the kinds of ideas we're exploring, and as I say, it's very much a joint effort for all of us. Is there anything else that anyone is keen to ask? Well, in that case, I should just like to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you too to the organizers of TEFAF New York for inviting me to present some of these ideas. I do hope that you will enjoy the fair, and I hope that too that you'll come and see our Maiolica exhibition that, as I say, opened today. These are all activities for a busy New York weekend. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So thank you all. Thank you to Luke for that brilliant kickoff to TEFAF Week and inspiring us all, challenging us all to think differently about older art. I welcome all of you to join us for a reception afterwards in the back of the theater, and perhaps you can put some questions to Luke that you might not wanted to have asked in front of a larger audience.